Hey guys, this video is for APUS for my juniors. You should be watching this on Tuesday, which is our asynchronous period. So make sure you remember you watch these videos from start to finish. And if you haven't sent me your homework assignment through Jupiter Grades, please do that. Please do that immediately. All right, so today we're going to talk about, continue talking about U.S. foreign policy. Now, remember, that's been our theme for the past few classes and videos. The United States is embracing a much more imperialist policy, where we're asserting our influence abroad. With the Spanish-American War, we conquered the Philippines. We're kind of pulling the strings in Cuba, and then, of course, the last thing we talked about in our live class. We secured the Panama Canal by detaching Panama, by inciting rebellion in Panama. So the Panamanians rebelled from Colombia, became an independent country, and then they gave us permission to build the Panama Canal. And remember, Theodore Roosevelt said that this was the greatest achievement of his life, building the Panama Canal, which, remember, enabled shipping to go from the East Coast to the West Coast much more easily. So you go like New York to San Francisco, you go like this, as opposed to all the way around the tip of South America and having to come all the way back up. So so we're definitely, we incited a rebellion, basically to give the Panamanians independence from Colombia, just so we could build the canal. So the United States is certainly really throwing its weight around, particularly in Latin America, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, a lot of Americans didn't really believe that going into Latin America, intervening in Latin America, was imperialism in the way that, say, conquering the Philippines was. There could be a variety of reasons for this. I think the biggest reason is the fact that Latin America is geographically close to us. So a lot of Americans feel that Latin America is our neighbor. So therefore, if we're intervening, it's more like our own backyard. So somehow that made it better, or something. Now, Theodore Roosevelt, remember, was a big supporter of U.S. imperialism, to begin with. And he really wanted the United States to have a very large role in Latin America, particularly. Now, 1904, the Dominican Republic defaulted on their debts. They owed a tremendous amount of debts to European banks. So Roosevelt had this fear that the Europeans would actually come into the Dominican Republic and take it over. And remember, according to the Monroe Doctrine, the United States would not allow European nations to actually come in and intervene in Latin America. So Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, a corollary means an add-on. So the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine gave the United States the right to intervene in any Latin American nation where we felt there was, quote, chronic wrongdoing. So the United States wanted to prevent Europeans from coming over and taking charge of the Dominican Republic in order to get their money back. So we intervened in the Dominican Republic, sorted out their finances, got the Europeans repaid, and that way we kept Europeans from taking over or invading or intervening in the Dominican Republic. Now, the Roosevelt corollary, which gave the United States permission to intervene in Latin America whenever we felt there was chronic wrongdoing, was basically a blank check, right, for the United States to intervene whenever we felt we wanted to, or we had to do that. Now, one of Roosevelt's favorite expressions, his favorite expression was bully. He used to say every time he was excited, like, oh boy, that'd be the equivalent. So that term bully became identified with Roosevelt. But after that, his second favorite phrase was an old African proverb: speak softly and carry a big stick. So a lot of that is kind of self-explanatory, right? Basically be polite. Don't yell and scream and harangue, but at the same time be firm. So speak softly, but carry a big stick. Be polite, but be strong. So that, and be well-mannered and courteous, but show strength at the same time. So Theodore Roosevelt's policy from that point on became known as the big stick policy, where, we felt like we had the right to intervene in Latin America whenever we felt it was appropriate. This was the beginning of a lot of, well, I won't say the beginning, but this was the continuation of a lot of Latin American resentment toward the United States, where a lot of Latin Americans felt that the United States just intervened in Latin America whenever we wanted to, and as you can imagine, they really did not like that. So we not invaded, but we kind of intervened in the Dominican Republic, sorted out their finances because there was chronic wrongdoing. But the United States also asserted influence in Asia as well. One of Roosevelt's biggest fears was that Japan was going to get too powerful and would eventually pose a threat to the United States. Fast forward to 1941, I guess a lot of people after Pearl Harbor, a lot of people would argue that maybe Roosevelt's concern about that had some merit. Well, during Roosevelt's presidency, Russia and Japan were at war with one another. And Roosevelt actually invited the Russians and the Russo-Japanese War. So Roosevelt invited the Russians and the Japanese to the United States and helped mediate a peace agreement between the Russians and between the Japanese. And again, one of his biggest concerns, Roosevelt, was growing Asian influence, or Japanese influence particularly, and he wanted to check that. So ultimately, a peace deal that Roosevelt negotiated was reached by the Russians and the Japanese. The Japanese later regretted that peace deal because they felt they had given away too much to the Russians. They felt they had, kind of been hounded into doing it by the United States. But the role that Roosevelt played in actually ending the Russo-Japanese War earned Teddy Roosevelt the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. He's the first U.S. president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Subsequent presidents who won were President Wilson in 1919, ex-President Carter for the role that he had played in world affairs after his presidency. He won in 2002. President Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize as well in 2009. President Trump was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize a few weeks ago. Good luck with that one. Okay, so in 1906, the continuing, this concern about Japan. In 1906, the state of California began segregating Japanese school children from white school children. And there's a lot of Japanese Americans living in California for generations, and the Japanese government found out that the segregation was happening in California schools, separating children of Japanese descent from white children, and they protested quite loudly and to President Roosevelt. And even though the federal government, especially back then, had very little to do with the schools, because that's really a state and local concern, Theodore Roosevelt got California to change its policy and not segregate white children from Japanese children. In return, the Japanese government agreed that it would stop any further Japanese immigration to the United States. This is the so-called gentleman's agreement. A gentleman's agreement, you still hear that term used every once in a while. A gentleman's agreement is when, when two sides make a deal and then they shake on it. And that's your bond. If your handshake and your word. So it's a gentleman's agreement. So this is actually really insulting, right? We'd stop segregation. Roosevelt would stop the segregation in the school system in California, which is good, but in return, California wouldn't let any more Japanese people immigrate to the United States. So that is quite insulting, I think. But there was this great fear in the United States of what was called very offensively, the yellow peril, that this Asian influence was going to become too great and would ultimately threaten the United States. You could argue the roots of that are in the 1870s, when there was this big blowback against Chinese immigration, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which, by the way, was still on the books in 1907. It was still on the books until the 1940s. China was our ally in World War II, so that made that law being on the books kind of awkward. So then finally the law was changed. But this fear of Asian influence, first the Chinese and then the Japanese, is clearly evident in the gentleman's agreement. But also, you could even go further back and say, well, the fact that the California decided to segregate the school system shows the deep racism that existed toward Asians during this time, and that's not talked about anywhere near enough. A lot of times in our the racial dynamic in the United States is understandably seen as a white black thing, but there was a lot of discrimination against Asians, and of course the deep mistreatment of Native American people, right, from the founding of our country. So it's the history of racism in the United States is a little bit more complex of a picture than is sometimes painted. Now, in 1907, Roosevelt decided to send 16 battleships, the Great White Fleet, to Asia, and they began on a so-called training mission. And the ships kind of went around Japan, and of course, a primary motivation behind this wasn't to train them, but it was to intimidate the Japanese, to basically show the Japanese, look what we got, so don't start with us. So that was definitely a motivation. So Theodore Roosevelt really embraced a muscular U.S. foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt actually, his views became even more hawkish or aggressive as time went on. As an ex-president in the mid-19-teens, Roosevelt was probably the biggest advocate for the United States intervention in the First World War. He was banging the war drum for years. The United States didn't enter the First World War. We'll talk about the First World War in our live class on Thursday. But the United States didn't enter the First World War until 1917. So we were not involved for the first 3 years of the war. And Roosevelt, as an ex-president, was a very big advocate of the United States entering the war on the side of the Allies, almost making it into like a test of manhood. So Roosevelt's aggressive views continued. In fact, in many ways, got worse as time went on. I actually have to say those last few years of Roosevelt's life were not his finest hour at all. With his really incessant push for the United States to get involved in World War I. So let's talk about now the foreign policy of the two presidents who came after Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. Now, William Howard Taft, remember, was Roosevelt's handpicked successor, who he eventually turned on. But Taft became president, and he was not a big supporter of the big stick. He's a big stick foreign policy. He supported something called dollar diplomacy. Now, dollar diplomacy was the idea that U.S. foreign policy should center around protecting American business interests abroad. So you could argue that maybe this is less expansionist or less imperialist than the big stick, even though you could also argue it's more cynical, right? Because at least the big stick foreign policy had the illusion of we're trying to help the Latin Americans. Here, there's none of that. It's basically saying that we're just intervening to help American business. In 1911, the United States intervened in Nicaragua to support both militarily and financially a pro-American dictator in Nicaragua. And in exchange for $1 million, the dictator of Nicaragua gave the United States control of Nicaragua's banks, its customs service, and its railroads. So we basically took over most of the important things in Nicaragua. A rebellion took place in 1912 in Nicaragua that was actually put down by U.S. troops. And after that, the United States stayed in Nicaragua for the next 20 years. So we were basically occupying the country for decades. We attempted to build a railroad in China, and as a part of dollar diplomacy, that had the support of the Taft administration. So less imperialist, intervening in less places, but in many ways more cynical, because he says, Roosevelt said Taft said it's all about money and American business. Now, the next president after Taft was Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson advocated something called moral diplomacy. Wilson was an anti-imperialist. He did not believe, at least he said he was, he did not believe the United States should be involved in trying to throw its weight around the world, or certainly not involved in taking over other countries. He said big stick and dollar diplomacy were both greedy and imperialistic. This is what Wilson said. The United States will never again seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. So that is a rejection of the imperialist foreign policy of the United States. Since 1898. Wilson became president in 1913. So for 15 years, basically, the United States kind of was embracing this very expansionist, imperialist foreign policy, and Wilson rejected that. But even though he rejected that, Wilson actually wound up intervening more in Latin America than either Roosevelt or Taft, but under different pretenses. Now, there were some measures in moral diplomacy that were attempting to be more conciliatory. For example, Wilson issued an apology to Colombia for inciting the rebellion in Panama against Colombia, just so he could build the canal. Wilson agreed on a policy of self-government for the Philippines. We signed conciliation treaties with a lot of countries around the world, saying that if we have a problem with you, we're going to have a cooling off period, and we're going to try to negotiate our differences as opposed to resorting to violence. But Wilson wound up intervening in Latin America a lot more than Roosevelt or Taft. In 1915, Wilson, the United States government, sent Marines to occupy both Haiti and the Dominican Republic because he said that, they were not managing their affairs correctly. In Haiti, we basically took over, wrote a new constitution for Haiti, which was very friendly to the United States, and then occupied Haiti for the next 19 years. So from 1915 until 1934, the United States basically ran Haiti. In the Dominican Republic, we also took over there and occupied that country for the next 9 years. Again, under the pretense that we have to do this in order to sort out their affairs, that they're not managing right, so they need the United States to do it for them. Now, the place in Latin America that was probably the site of the biggest turmoil during the Wilson years was Mexico. Now, Mexico, remember, our neighbor to the south, we fought a war with them 70 years earlier. We took a lot of their country, right? That's the modern-day states of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. So, since then, things had, I wouldn't say our relationship was great. We kind of, tolerated one another, but it was a very awkward kind of relationship between the United States and Mexico. Well, Mexico was the scene of a chaotic revolution in the early 19-teens. The longtime dictator of Mexico, a man named Diaz, who'd been the dictator for 35 years in Mexico, he was overthrown and replaced by a reformer named Madero. Now, Madero wasn't president for long. He was ultimately murdered and replaced by a general, a man named General Huerta. Now, Wilson wanted to make it his priority to protect Americans who were living in Mexico, as well as American business interests. The United States actually had over $2 billion invested in Mexico. So we had a stake in what was going on in Mexico. And Wilson refused to recognize the government of Huerta. He said it's not a legitimate government, and instead sold American arms to a rival general, a man named Carranza. Now, we had some ugly incidents in Mexico. In 1914, an American soldier was arrested in Tampico, Mexico. We basically, were threatening aggressive action against Mexico, but then they apologized to the United States and fired a 21-gun salute to the American flag. 21-gun salute is the highest salute that you can give. Like the president gets a 21-gun salute when he makes an appearance. So that's a sign of highest respect. So the Mexicans fired a 21-gun salute to the American flag to apologize for the arrest of the American soldier, the so-called Tampico Affair. In 1914, the United States, in an attempt to try to control Huerta, a government that whose government Wilson did not support, the United States blockaded the city of Veracruz. Now, very condescendingly, Wilson said, "I am going to teach the Latin Americans to elect good men." So we occupied the city of Veracruz. 7,000 troops, American troops, occupy Veracruz. We fight Huerta's forces. 22 American soldiers were killed in this engagement. 500 Mexicans were killed as well. Interestingly, this, it's completely forgotten about the Veracruz incident today, but 65 American soldiers won the Congressional Medal of Honor for bravery in the Veracruz situation. That's half of all the awards that were given, Congressional Medal of Honors that were given in all of World War I a few years later. So it's forgotten about today, but at the time it was recognized as a place of real American bravery against the enemy. Ultimately, Huerta lost power, and Carranza, who was Wilson's choice, did replace him, which was what American foreign policy at the time desired. Problems with Mexico continued. In 1916, Pancho Villa, who was a Mexican bandit, he killed 16 American mining engineers who were working in Mexico, and then he went over the border, went to Columbus, New Mexico, burnt down the town, and it's a ranching town, and killed 19 Americans. So there were 35 Americans who were killed as a result of Pancho Villa and his bandits. There wasn't much of a political agenda there, being like Americans, of course, but it was more banditry and theft. So Woodrow Wilson sent General John Pershing to pursue Pancho Villa, who then staged another raid in Texas and killed even more Americans there. 150,000 National Guardsmen were sent to the U.S.-Mexico border during this time, and ultimately we did not catch Pancho Villa. The whole engagement was unsuccessful. The next year we wound up involved in World War I. In fact, one of the things that actually got us involved in World War I was that the Germans were encouraging the Mexicans to enter the war on the side of Germany, and in return Germany would help Mexico recapture all the territory they lost in the Mexican War in the 1840s. That was in the so-called Zimmermann Telegram. That was one of the big reasons why the United States ultimately entered the Mexican War in 1917. And hearing that in a vacuum might not make sense. Like, why is Germany trying to make overtures to Mexico? But we had been having problems with Mexico for years. So the Germans thought the Mexicans might be receptive to their offer. Now, all this intervention created a lot of ill will toward the United States. And Wilson was very idealistic in his way. He felt that the United States had to play a very large role, or maybe the role, in countries around the world in order to mold their societies in more idealistic lines. We will carry liberty and justice and humanity wherever we go. We'll sell goods to make the world comfortable and happy and convert them to American principles. So, moral diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson was ultimately very imperialistic itself, even though Wilson would certainly reject that because he considered himself an ardent anti-imperialist. So U.S. foreign policy completely transformed from the period from 1898 to 1917. We purchased the Virgin Islands in 1917 from Denmark. The Virgin Islands is still part of the United States to this day, at least the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we went from a third-rate power in the late 1890s, without much influence or respect, to a real world power now. Having fought the Spanish-American War, taking over the Philippines, intervening in Cuba, ultimately Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, Mexico. So we were heavily involved in world affairs, and in a very imperialistic way, during starting in 1898, and ultimately by 1917, we were a very, very different country. All right, guys. So very good. Remember to watch these videos from start to finish. So make sure you do that. Make sure you hand in your assignment if you haven't done so. Also, Tuesday night is the first presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So I would definitely urge you all to check that out. That really should be quite that should be something. All right, guys. So I'll see you in our live class. On Thursday. All right. Peace.